Question 7 is a function question. Now, function questions on the reading section really ask us to look at a specific part of the passage. Now, usually that part is the underlined sentence, the sentence before, and the sentence after. You'll notice in this passage, though, that I really only have 2 sentences. So if I use my regular logic for function questions, I have to read the entire passage. But if you start reading the passage, you'll notice really quickly that the passage itself is actually really dense. There's a lot of terminology, a lot of more difficult vocabulary, and it's just not a really easy passage to navigate through. What's more is all 4 answer choices are all super long, and they all use really difficult terminology and vocabulary as well. Now remember that in the reading section, you get around 1 minute and 15 seconds to solve each question. It doesn't seem likely, even for myself, to see a passage for the first time, read the entire passage, understand it at 100%, read all 4 answer choices this long at 100%, and solve that question, pick a correct answer, move on in under 1 minute and 15. That really is very, very difficult. And it's really not likely that a student is going to be able to do it while you're taking an official SAT test. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to solve this question by reading less. And I'm going to do that by going through reading and skimming. I'm going to show you how I do that. I start by skimming the passage and I see this word found. Now I know from my main idea questions that a finding or any kind of result is actually a really important sentence to read. And I notice that the second part of this underlined sentence is also a but sentence. It's also a yet sentence. And those are super important on the SAT. But sentences are always the most important sentence. So I'm going to read the entire underlined portion. So we said that we found negligible electoral consequences for governments that impose fiscal austerity measures. Now, I'm not going to let the fact that maybe I don't understand what fiscal austerity measures are stop me from understanding the rest of the sentence. Because all I really need to know is that there was a study, and what we found is that governments are imposing something, but there were negligible, meaning insignificant consequences for what they did. So governments do these measures, but they're not that really important. It's really doesn't really matter. There aren't a lot of consequences or important consequences attached to it. But some governments recently suffered electorally because of these programs. So that's going to make me go, hey, what's going on? These 2 sentences or clauses oppose each other. The first one says, hey, these austerity measures, not really important. Second sentence says, well, some governments actually suffered because of those measures recently, though. And so we think, well, okay, there's this difference going on here. I wonder why. Now, the next sentence is going to explain to me why. So some researchers attribute this congruity. So attribute means, whoops, I'm not going to circle that. Attribute means to credit, and incongruity means difference. So the words I'm actually defining here are words that we should know for the SAT. So they're crediting this difference to what? What's the reason for it? The government's tendency to implement austerity programs strategically to avoid electoral costs. So it's the government's fault. It's the government deciding to impose or implement these programs at a specific time to cut costs. So it's the government's fault. I'm going to stop reading here because I found there was this problem or some kind of difference going on in the first sentence, and then I figured out the reason for that, right? They explained to me why that is. I'm going to stop reading. Notice what I'm not reading. I'm not reading the stuff in between dashes, and I'm not reading the stuff in between parentheses. And the reason for that is that these 2 parts are both looking at detail sentences. So I don't want to look at detail sentences right now because the passage is so dense and the answer choices are so dense. I really just want to focus on the main idea and see if I can eliminate answer choices based on that. So I've just done that. I'm going to go look at the answer choices now. First thing I notice, I'm going to skim through all 4 answer choices. I noticed that all 4 answer choices in the first lines use the word discrepancy, conflict, divergence, exception. So what this tells me, these are all synonyms for incongruity. So just based on the first sentence, I'm not going to be able to eliminate any answer choices. I'm going to actually have to read all 4 answer choices. So let's start with answer choice A. Answer choice A says there's a discrepancy between what has been observed in study settings, so that's our findings, and what has been observed in real world settings. Okay, that's what's been going on with some of those governments. That the text goes on to assert is attributable to the studies not using real world data. Well, it's not the study's fault, and it's not the data's fault. We saw that in the passage. It's the government's fault. It's not the data, and it's not the studies. So A is incorrect. Answer choice B then says there's a difference between the findings, all right, and the recent events. Okay, I like that. Then the text goes on to suggest is a consequence of a complicating factor in the data used to generate those findings. Now, the first time I read this, I go question mark. It's very general, and they don't really use any of the words I saw in the passage. So I'm a little confused, but there's nothing in there that is a definite no. So I'm going to leave that for now. Now I'm going to go on to answer choice C. Answer choice C says there's a divergence in the research findings. Immediately I'm going to stop because what C is saying is that there's a difference in the findings. So what answer choice C is saying is that here's a finding and here's a finding and they oppose each other. That's what answer choice C is saying. But what the passage is saying, if we understood what we read correctly, is that what the findings have shown and what's actually going on in the government don't agree with each other. There's a divergence or difference there. So it's not between 2 different kinds of findings. So this is incorrect. If we somehow missed that and we continued reading, you would notice that it says there's different groups of researchers using data from different circumstances, and that's why there's this divergence. Well, we haven't seen different types of researchers, different groups and different electoral circumstances, and it's really not the data's fault. The passage made it clear it's the government's fault, but they're not talking about that in answer choice C. So C is also incorrect. Now, answer choice D says there's an exception to a general pattern. Sure, we might understand the pattern to be the findings, the several studies, and the exception to be recent events. I'm fine with that. That the text goes on to explain is a result of researchers. So again, we're saying here it's a researcher's fault. Now that this difference is attributed to researchers, but we know again that it's not researchers, it's the government. So for that reason, for the same reason, C and D are both incorrect, and I know, well, I'm going to pick answer choice B as the correct answer. Now, if I was actually solving this question in a real test situation, I would pick answer choice B here and move on. I would flag this question, but I would not spend more time trying to make sure that B is the correct answer because I'm very certain that A, C, and D are incorrect based on what I did read. So I would flag this question. Now, if you do find yourself at the end of the module having a little bit of time, you might come back to this question, and if you do, you might read the part that you didn't the first time. And for me, that's going to really be this last clause. And if you read the last clause of this passage, you'll notice it goes, which has obscured or made more difficult or complicated, what? The inherent political risks of austerity measures, which is the factor that we're looking at, or the studies are focusing on, in the election data scholars have examined or in the data that scholars use to generate those findings. You will notice that this last clause is the exact same meaning as the last bit in answer choice B. So you might think, hey, well, if I read that sentence the first time, wouldn't I be able to more quickly find that answer choice B is the correct answer? Sure, you might if you had enough time, but remember again, we have 1:15 to solve this question. There really aren't a lot of students that in 1:15 would have read this last clause in the passage, read answer choice B, and said, hey, those two are the same exact idea, especially when you notice that they're using entirely different words to describe the same idea. If you can do this, that's amazing. Definitely use that test day. But if you can't, no need to fret. Notice that I can get to the same correct answer by reading just the main idea parts in the passage and eliminating the incorrect answer choices amongst the four. And that is a perfectly fine and effective, efficient way to solve function questions on the digital SAT. So question 7, B is the correct answer.